thank you for having me and the opportunity to be here from across the globe. It's actually 8:30 in the evening here, which is a very nice time to be at a conference, actually, much nicer than the 3 a.m. that I've cleared. So thanks a lot to the organisers for this and for the opportunity to speak to you guys. So this is elaborating on a paper that I previously published about the stereotype of the teen witch. So you can see the teen witch is here on the right side of the screen. And I want to extend on this by playing with a mechanism that I saw at play that I didn't have time to fully elaborate on, and this is the idea of metaphor. So we'll spend the first half of this discussing this teen witch stereotype, or what I call polluting category, and then the second half of it introducing conceptual metaphor theory, which I hope people will find useful, and its applicability to this idea. So this is drawing on research. It's actually from 2005, so it might seem like it's historical, but I've definitely seen these tropes still in use within recent years. This research was in Auckland, New Zealand, and so paganism at that time was booming, but in a very New Zealandy way, which is to say we're not a big country. There's about 4 million people there at the time. And as you can see from these census figures down the bottom here, it sort of moved from being quite niche, with some traditional, a few traditional covens and magical orders, to being a lot more like a community. This is not counted here, by the way. This is the just pagans that in 1906 were counted as no religion, but then became a different category. And so this is very much in line with international trends, what was called pagan explosion, and for pretty much the same reasons. So influenced by the availability of information, books for solitary practitioners, the internet as a way to communicate with others and to get information and popularity in popular culture. So accordingly then, a lot of the practices that you would have seen in contemporary pagan witchcraft would be very familiar to people who have looked at pagan witchcraft across the globe. And in a similar way, the issues and the debates, the tensions were very similar. A lot of emphasis on eclectic witchcraft at this time as well. And it should be mentioned, actually, given the context of this particular conference, that while this is similar to Anglophone and particularly settler societies, so I'm looking particularly at Australia, perhaps to a lesser extent Canada and the US, there's really no sense that among the white practitioners, and pretty much all of them were white, or a large chunk of them, that they were doing anything that their ancestors were doing in this space. It's all imported, what one would call universalist, and while there are indigenous beliefs and practices, I'd suggest that at the time they didn't influence contemporary paganism in a meaningful way, and probably still don't. So I was interested in teenage witches, and so this is a small study, 12 self-identified witches between age between 14 and 19. Typical of the demographics, a lot of them were white, a lot of them were female, so only 2 males. Most of them were aged 18 to 19, which I think was influenced also by my ethics requirements, that if you were 16 or under, you needed parental permission. And I wasn't really interested in boundary making at this time. I was more interested in sort of getting a general scope of people's beliefs, their practices, how they came to the religion, but this boundary making, these boundary making practices became really quite apparent in these interviews, and people often seemed to feel a lot more comfortable talking about what they learned and what they didn't believe than they felt talking about what they actually did or did believe. So the other here that I'm talking about is a particular kind of other. It's not a distant other like Christianity, like an absolute other. Instead, I'm talking about the negotiation of the boundaries and characteristics of contemporary paganism by othering people who seem, and practices seem like they would be relevant, but are considered undesirable. So I've got a graph there that image that shows this there, that's drawn from the area of subcultural authenticity. So the idea of core, peripheral, and completely outside. And it's the authentic membership that's the core there. Le Monde is a wonderful term for the name that we give for these people that we are branding as undesirable, negotiating our own authenticity on the basis of, and that is a polluting category, which I think is kind of wonderfully visceral. And it is worth emphasising that this negotiation, like if it's wielded, it shouldn't be taken as an absolute statement of fact. In fact, one of the ways that I establish my authenticity is to say that you are not authentic. So we found this very much with, I saw this very much with these teenage participants, that this wasn't a category that was put upon them from the outside, but in fact they were using it to describe less desirable, less authentic other people their own age. And so I've got a few characteristics of that encapsulating this quite from Fiona, and probably a lot of this will seem quite familiar to you if you're at all familiar with the culture at the time. It's also quite similar to another polluting category that you're probably familiar with, that of the fluffy bunny, that Pagan would describe quite nicely in 2007. The key difference here is that fluffy bunny can in theory be wielded at anybody. It's said to have connotations of youth, but you can still definitely be a fluffy bunny in your 30s or 40s or something. Tea, which is specifically about young people. And actually because of this, it also sometimes is used in a way that is almost seems descriptive rather than as a sanction. So I was actually prompted into doing this by a very well-respected international author at a Pagan festival who just said as a general explanation that there was a lot of young witches about because they all seemed Brno the Teenage Witch, which is, if you're familiar with it, very fantastical as a talking cat, with sort of explosions and quite dramatic Hollywood magic. And they completely believed this was a true thing. And this was, of course, received with great nodding from the marquee full of older people who were quite safe in the knowledge that this kind of derogatory characterisation was never going to be applied to them. So this teenage witch idea is overdetermined. It is fed by a number of things. So yes, it has a lot of characteristics of the fluffy bunny, and so Pagan would argue that these are linked to tensions within the community at the time that are related to some of the things that I talked about in terms of the changes. So this increase in people, commodified products, etc., etc. But it also rested on long-standing characterizations of young people. So even if you're utterly ignorant of trends within witchcraft, you could still very easily recognize the kind of tropes that were being drawn on. Young people are meant to be creatures of media, right? They're meant to be subject to commodified products and insusceptible to them. They're meant to be interested in fashion and style. They're meant to be frivolous in their interests. So there's this documentary, a British one, Teenage Hicks, The Witch Craze, that I'm using as an example here because it's intended for people that know absolutely nothing about the tensions and the issues within contemporary pagan witchcraft, but would still recognise this idea of here are people just doing things for a short period of time. So I'd argue here that these dichotomies, I didn't turn on my timer, how annoying, that these dichotomies are also given emotional resonance and persuasiveness by this depth shallow metaphor. So these things are all building on each other. So that's what I want to explore now. And this is drawing on cognitive metaphor theory or conceptual metaphor theory. So the basic principle in this is that metaphor is a fundamental feature of human thought. It's not just something that we do when we're trying to be persuasive or communicate. It might not be something that we can do consciously or deliberately. So one of the things that people operating in this area try to do is to bring these metaphors to consciousness, so highlight that they are at play in what they are doing. So a metaphor here is understood as understanding one thing in terms of another, and particularly something that is complex or new or ambiguous or nuanced, like hard to grasp. I found a Kinsey quote from the previous keynote quite useful in this, right? There's all this complexity, and then to do anything with it, to utilise it and to communicate it, we simplify. So here's complexity on the left there, being simplified to a basic thing, which in this case is up and down. And the argument here is that is often given is that these bodily metaphors are particularly potent for these purposes. They're incredibly well practiced. They are also very good at communicating, it's suggested, across cultural lines between diverse groups of people, because we will all share these experiences to enough of a degree that it is familiar, it's recognisable. one of the cool things about this conference is there are so many cultures and so many languages in the audience, so I'm very interested to see about how these translate or if they don't translate, because this is one of the arguments about cross-cultural comparison. Giving you a key text, I've gone off the page, sorry about that. And these metaphors, while they are simplifications, they're also incredibly rich. So they're much more than basic information, but they're often laden with experiences, with emotions, with valence. There is something desirable, is it not? They're also used to structure thought, including, it's argued, these tables of dichotomies, like the one I showed you a few slides ago. They are elaborated on by culture as well, but even academic thought is argued often has a bodily basis, and Larkin does some interesting things here with maths and politics and philosophy. So this concept of depth that I'm drawing on here hopefully will be something that will be familiar to you. I think of depth and I think of swimming into the bottom of a swimming pool, and the sense of pressure increasing the deeper I go, that sort of that sound and increased effort the further I go. And the point here is that it's a feeling, right? It's not just an abstract idea, but it's rich and it's multi-dimensional, and it's got a feeling to it that is perhaps like other feelings that could be applied in other situations. So here are ways that, at least in Anglophone countries, we talk about depth. So we talk about like deep down a hole, deep in the ocean, cool. But we also talk about things like going deep into a forest. We talk about deep space, so those regions of space that are far beyond what we can interact with, even with a normal telescope, where they sort of become incomprehensibly far away and alien. That's depth. In a similar way, when we talk about deep time, we've got this fossil here, so going beyond regular history to something far beyond that. We have deep thought. So I also see in marking meetings quite a lot of people talking that they want more depth to an argument. So what does they need here? I argue that all of these share an element of moreness to them. They go beyond immediacy. So there's an element perhaps of journey to them, an element of effort, like going to the swimming pool, an element perhaps of the hidden. So that which is deep is not immediately grasped, right? It's something that will take time or whatever to try and fathom, like that word there, to comprehend. And this is absolutely applied to people as well. So all that we don't show, all that we don't know about ourselves perhaps, is given at least in sort of Western Anglophone culture, is a long history of being given a spatiality. It's inside us. So Charles Taylor has this wonderful quote that talks about how we think of ourselves as having hidden depths in the same way as we think of ourselves, just as naturally as we think of ourselves as having arms or legs or a liver. And it's incredibly well practiced. And fitting with the idea then of depth as structuring thought, Wachtel has this interesting idea of how within psychoanalysis, this metaphor of depth and its association with time actually becomes a problem when you have psychoanalysts who are equating earlier with deeper, with more fundamental, with more foundational. Then this is seen as more important, and the insights that it seemed to be generating are considered more profound. And of course this highlights the valence to this, right? The desirability of depth. Everyone wants to be deep, nobody wants to be superficial, nobody wants to be shallow. There's very much a difference in the value of things. And so Wachtel suggests that psychoanalysts may disregard more immediate things, more recent things, more cultural influences in favour of these more valued deep ideas. So I've given you a wee table here to talk about, compare depth with its binary opposite, that of superficiality. And so this includes the value of it as depth is highly valued, superficiality is low. And I would suggest that many of these characteristics of the fluffy bin, but particularly the Tenwich stereotype, are actually aligned with this right-hand side here, these characteristics of superficiality, as compared to ideas that may be understood through and seen as coherent with these characteristics of depth. And this is facilitated by this concept of authenticity, which I'm defining here as a state of knowing and being oneself in the face of outside influence that I'd suggest is particularly valued within contemporary pagan witchcraft. And this itself has a speciality. This is the illustrious Dr. Phil. I don't know if you guys have him, but talking about your authentic self as your core is resisting these outside influences and needs to be discovered with time and effort. So these devalued characteristics then that people are so concerned about, ways that they may connect. So commodification, that was the other within the thing that we've had a lot of people concerned about, particularly in the 90s, including within pagan studies. It's very much an outside force. It's associated with ephemerality, but it's also characteristic by a surface motivation or a shallow motivation as compared to stealing and how authentically from more valued characteristics, from mysteries, from religious truths. Very reminiscent of Adorno and Pagan's idea here that it's often to be sailed, it's also watered down. It is made to have less substance to it in order to sell. Spirituality has a long history of being associated with depth and authenticity. So I've got I've got a quote from a 17th century mystic, sort of describing the depth to spirituality, the ultimate and that which cannot be fathomed immediately, right? It wouldn't be called spirituality. There wouldn't be a point to it if you could just grasp it like that, with the obvious exception of like the road to Damascus. And teenage witches then were seen to have a presumed shallow interest, or superficial interest. This was in some of the scholarly literature around them. And then when this was being challenged, they were saying that these young people were surprisingly serious, characterised by time or effort, or interest in things beyond the immediate. This is ephemerality is associated with massification, which is this big concern with young witches at the time. And I found it really interesting that the popularisation of witchcraft at that time was thought of with great concern of in terms of dilution, in terms of creating a thinness, of removing some of the substance. Popularisation via media, so the feel of media is very much opposed to that of depth. If we talk about postmodernity, for example, it's characterised by media, it's characterised by image, by depthlessness, by weightlessness, as Baudrillard talked about, by a lack of substance. Media is defined by speed, so media that is not defined by speed, we don't call media, right? Like books, especially classic books, we don't really categorise as media. Instead, it's described in terms of these new things, these surface things, these very fast things. Compared to true art with depth to it, compared to practical knowledge. And so a lot of concern with media at this time and contrast between that and an authentic pagan practice. And my suggestion here is that when we're articulating surfaceness with young people, it may mean that even if you go beyond the idea of young people being susceptible, like cultural dupes, credulous to media, they may still become aligned with inauthenticity, even if they're characterised by the media savviness, which they also sometimes characterise as possessing. Style, so literally depth or superficial, and somehow seems implied to be contrasted with spirituality, right? Like with the substance of spiritual, of true religion, spirituality. There's a link with fashion's ephemerality. It's really interesting. My teenage witches, I don't know how widespread this is, had a real emphasis on internalisation. So moved away from using tools. Some of them would describe that half of them described that they'd been involved for over 6 years. So, not brand new to this, and describing themselves moving away from overt external rituals towards something that they felt was more internalised and more part of them. And this was portrayed as more valued here, moving away from style. And of course, youth then is seen as unstable without that rooted complexity to who they are. They're portrayed as being fundamentally unauthentic in search for themselves, tied with massification, commodification, media. You can think of many stereotypes relating to this, but also crucially lacking time depth, right? Both in themselves, in the sense of that they're themselves sort of seen as real, but also within a group. Is somebody talking to me?
1 minute.
I have a time.
1 minute.
1 minute, yes. I can do 1 minute. Brilliant. And so here is a summary of things I've said. I will not say it again, but this is a summary of things I've said. But I would suggest the applicability to other things. This idea of time depth, this weight of history. This, I wonder, might be characteristic of other othernesses, of other distinctions that you guys are interested in. I was really struck by the prevalence of history in this definition of pagan yesterday, and especially in the keynote, the idea that history has been so many things, it's so subject to what we want and where we are right now. And yet, somehow still seem, even knowing this, it still sort of seems valuable. It seems to add a weightiness to it that is opposed to things that seem more fleeting, more surface, easier to fathom, and then somehow perhaps less valuable. So, my suggestion in going through this is that when people are talking about the others, potentially metaphors might be a useful thing to look for, and particularly the way that these might attribute maximum valuing of things seem natural. I'd be so interested to see how this relates to what other people have seen in their areas of interest. So I shall stop my share.